Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Following the conclusion of the Civil War, Northern women who served as nurses formed organizations or joined auxiliaries to men's groups to remember their contributions, to celebrate their sisterhood, their patriotism, their common purpose during the war, and to take care of each other as they entered the fall and winter of their lives. Some went on to become doctors. Many became involved in progressive movements in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and a few even lived to see women's suffrage. Several books document their experiences, all wonderful primary sources, and they are also fascinating reads. One of them is titled Our Army Nurses, written by Mary Gardner. It was published in 1895. Inside, Gardner profiles more than 100 patriotic women who stepped forward to care for sick and wounded soldiers. Each account is fascinating. I'm going to share one with you now, and it captures my attention not only for her poignant story and for scholarly reasons, but also, as you'll find out, for personal reasons. So here we go. Here's how we begin. Before taking up my pen to write this sketch, and this is the woman here, I climbed to the top of the library and taking down a large old Latin book uniquely bound in hogskin and printed 3.5 centuries ago, I turned its musty, though well-preserved pages and found in a large official envelope another old and highly valued relic, the commission of an army nurse. In the same envelope was another commission dated at Philadelphia, June 1st, 1865, and signed by George H. Stewart, chairman of the United States Christian Commission. As I glanced over these old papers, my thoughts went back to these dates upon them, to the strange events that influenced my life, resulting in my becoming an army nurse and delegate of the United States Christian Commission. I thought of my wedding day when I stood at the altar and took upon myself the sweet and solemn marriage vows, of the 5 short months of unalloyed happiness that followed, then the enlisting of my young husband in the service of his country, how hard I tried to be brave as I clung to him in parting, then of the eagerly looked for letters, and at last the one that never came, but in its stead a message in a strange hand telling me of my husband's death and burial near Vicksburg, where his regiment had been sent to reinforce General Grant. To a true woman, there was no sweeter word than wife, no sadder one than widow. In less than a year, I had realized in my experience the meaning of both. The deep feeling of the heart had been touched by the hand of love, the tenderest feeling by the hand of death, and it is the experience of sorrow that prepares me to minister to others. After my husband's death, there came an intense desire to do something for the sick and wounded soldiers in the hospitals. But not knowing how to proceed to get a position as a nurse, I resumed my former occupation of school teaching. What had once been a delight now seemed irksome and distasteful. My first term of school had closed when I met a Mrs. Conrad who had been engaged in the Keokuk, Iowa hospital. She told me to correspond with Mrs. Wittenmeyer, who would give me the information necessary to secure a position in that hospital. I wrote to her at once and received a reply telling me to apply to James E. Yateman and enclosed testimonials of good moral character signed to my pastor and the ladies of the Aid Society where I lived. Following her directions, I soon had a letter from Mr. Yateman, but alas, there was no opening at that time. But he informed me that as soon as more ladies were needed, he would let me know. Months passed in anxious waiting. A winter term of school was begun and finished, and then came the long looked for commission and with it government transportation. I do not suppose an officer in the army, from general down to second lieutenant, ever received his commission with greater delight or enthusiasm. Little time was spent in preparing for my journey, for I was anxious to get at the work, and only a few days elapsed from the time I received my commission until I reported for duty where I had been assigned. The Benton Barracks Hospital in St. Louis was one of the largest in the West and included the amphitheater and other buildings in the fairgrounds of the St. Louis Agricultural Society. In this large hospital, there were often 2,000 patients. Dr. Russell of Natick, Massachusetts, the surgeon in charge, was every way fitted for this responsible position. One historian referring to him called him that able surgeon and earnest philanthropist. I shall ever cherish his memory. Only a few years ago, and a short time before his death, I received from him the kindest of letters and request that I send him my photograph and all other nurses I might have in my possession to be put on file in the archives of the Loyal Legion. I am sorry to say I neglected to send them. His home was in Winnehin, Massachusetts at the time of his death. Benton Barracks, when I was there, comprised a promiscuous throng: white and colored soldiers, refugees, contrabands, teachers, ministers, officers, families, etc. It was especially interesting to me to watch the colored soldiers on dress parade. They realized there was a vast difference between slavery and the overseer's lash and freedmen in the United States uniform, standing shoulder to shoulder with the men who had fought to make them free. It was a little amusing, too, to see a colored soldier marching a white comrade to the guardhouse, as was sometimes the case. They sank to the depths of humiliation themselves when detailed to do duty in the refugee hospitals, for they scorned the white trash. In the hospitals, they received the same careful nursing and everywhere the same humane treatment as the white soldier. Books had been furnished to them, and it was wonderful to see how eager they were to learn. I was deeply touched one day when one of them, an old man, drew from the pocket of his blue coat a testament and, bowing politely to me, said, "Please, Mrs., show me where to place where it tells about the many mansions and Jesus preparing the way." The day of my arrival at the hospital, I was met by Miss Emily Parsons, superintendent of the nurses. She was one peculiarly gifted and endowed for such a work, and it could be truly said of her, she opened her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue was the law of kindness. Her name recalls precious recollections, and I would offer this tribute to her memory. From her, I received instructions in regard to my appointment and my duties as matron of Ward D, General Hospital. The next morning, she opened the door and I followed her. I stood for the first time in the ward of the whitewashed wall where the sick and the dying lay. She soon retired, and I entered upon my work. The duty of the ward matron, as specified, was to attend to the special diet of the weaker patients, to see that the wards were kept in order, to minister to the wants of the patients, and to give them words of good cheer, both by reading and conversation, and to assist them in correspondence with their friends at home. Before I had made the rounds in my ward the first morning, my courage was put to the test. I approached a cot and, talking with the sick man, found he had the smallpox. His cot was only a few feet from my room, which joined the ward. The partition was not a plastered one, but boards placed on end, barn fashion, with strips nailed over the cracks. The air was virtually the same in both ward and nurse's room. Could I lie down and sleep knowing that every breath I took was freighted with this terrible contagion? I felt somewhat relieved, however, when, before the day was over, the patient was removed to the post hospital. Poor fellow, I soon heard of his death. I became accustomed to disease in its various forms, and even smallpox patients were attended with as much care as they remained in the ward as with others. Though I did escape the smallpox, I could not resist measles, but had the orthodox United States type of the malady. One thing I could not become accustomed to, and a heartsick feeling came over me always when I saw the undertaker's carriage pass along with its load of coffins going to the National Cemetery, as I have stood in those cemeteries and looked over the acres and acres of graves as close as they could be made where were lying our boys in blue. My feelings were indescribable. Appreciation and grateful to all, and the many army nurses received it without measure from those to whom she daily ministered. To hear a soldier say, as he bade her goodbye to join his regiment, after having been nursed back to health, "You have saved my life," was the richest compensation she could ever receive. We had in connection with the hospital one of those special diet kitchens originated by Mrs. Wettenmeyer, and it furnished delicate articles of food so grateful to the sick. It was delightful to me, after having gone the rounds with the surgeon of my ward, to go to this kitchen with my approved lists and see them filled, then hear the poor boys say as they tasted the tempting food, "This makes me think of home." It was in the hands of Miss Phoebe Allen of Washington, Iowa, that served us so faithfully in the diet kitchen for a while. Then we folded those hands to rest and wept tears of sorrow at her untimely death. As the Benton Barracks was so far removed from the seat of war, there was very little of an exciting character while I was there. The work of one day was much like that of every other. Once General Price threatened us, and every soldier who was able, in barracks and hospital, was ordered to sleep on his arms. I remember well that night. After taps had been sounded and lights were out, I went to my window and, looking out into the night, I wondered if the rebels would really come. After a while, I heard in the distance a sound like the tramping of horses' feet and the rumbling of wagon wheels, and I expected every moment that the entire force would be called out to attack General Price and his army. All remained quiet as usual. Still, I listened, and soon I could see in the moonlight a train of wagons approaching. It was an enemy in very truth, only loads of sour commissary bread. In March 1865, I was transferred to the Nashville Hospital, where Dr. Russell had gone and was serving as surgeon in charge. Before leaving Benton Barracks, the soldiers in the ward where I had been for nearly a year presented me with an elegant silk dress pattern in token of their goodwill. My work at Nashville was much as it had been before. Many of the patients had been engaged between Thomas and Hood. It was simply wonderful to see how bravely these men bore their misfortunes. One who had lost an arm was rejoicing over the fact that it was not a leg, while one who hobbled about on crutches thought he was very fortunate indeed not to have lost an arm, or worse, his head. A colored soldier, asked about a visitor what was the matter with him, replied, "The doctor says I have a dispensation of the heart." He meant a palpitation. There was a large house with beautiful grounds nearby, confiscated property, and we were allowed to gather the flowers that grew so abundantly. I remembered how we would arrange the tricolors, red, white, and blue, upon the little square stands that stood by each soldier's cot, not only bringing cheer to the sick, but calling forth the admiration of the inspecting officers. It was while I was at Nashville that the exciting news of the surrender of Lee's army was received. The cannon thundered forth from Fort Negley until the ground seemed to shake beneath our feet. Then, while the air was still vibrating with the echoes and the soldiers' jubilant shouts, a telegram announced the assassination of President Lincoln. In June, I was recalled to St. Louis to enter the work of the Christian Commission. The Sanitary Commission was about closing its work. The war was ended, but months must elapse before the soldier could return home. The Christian Commission, instead of disbanding, brought all of their resources to the great work of supplying the soldiers until they were finally mustered out. I left Nashville in July, and returning to Benton Barracks, I entered the old amphitheater again. the apartments occupied as the headquarters of the Christian Commission. How distinctly the room comes before me. Along the beams overhead were the words, Mother, Home, Heaven. Scripture mottos were on the walls. Long tables extended across the room where soldiers would come to write letters or read books and papers. On a little platform was a place usually occupied by a lady delegate of the commission, and above this was the motto, Let women's influence be felt in behalf of her country. Here, one of the ladies was usually found with busy hands distributing supplies to those who came into the reading room. The badge she wore was a safe passport to the hospital, barracks, or camp. She worked for God and humanity, and wherever she went, the blessing of the soldiers followed her. The work of mustering out was going on as rapidly as possible, and as the mighty armies melted away and our soldiers went from camp to home, the demand for workers grew less. At last, there came a day when we were needed no longer. Our work among the soldiers were done. December 3rd, 1865, I left St. Louis and reached my home at Troy, Iowa, in time to celebrate my 23rd birthday, which occurred the same month, having been gone almost 2 years. 1 year after my return, I was married to Reverend Eli Helmick Coddington. When the war broke out, he was a student at the Iowa Wesleyan University at Mount Pleasant. At the first call to arms, he enlisted in Company F, 14th Iowa Infantry. At the Battle of Fort Donelson, a rebel musket shot shattered his left arm, rendering a shoulder joint amputation necessary. After being discharged and regaining sufficient health, he entered college again. Then came the call for more men, and again he enlisted in the service of his country and was commissioned captain, Company H, 45th Iowa. Serving out his term, he was discharged and entered college the third time and graduated with the class of 1866. The following year, he entered the ministry, and in December, we were married. Though he had not fully recovered from the loss of his arm and knew he never would, yet he hoped his life might be spared long enough to bring him the realization of some of his bright hopes and aspiration. So with the brave and happy hearts, we enjoyed the present and planned for the future. 7 years of successful work in the ministry, 4 years of intense suffering. Then came the end. He was not, for God took him. 2 little children had preceded him to the heavenly home. 2 remained to my care and love, a son 10 years old, a daughter 5. I saw them grow to manhood and womanhood and graduate from the same college that graduated their father. My son entered journalism, but applied himself too closely to his work. Last May, his health failed, and his physician advised him to go to Colorado. In November, I was called to Denver to see him die, and I brought him home and laid him beside his father. When my daughter is not teaching school, she is with me, but for her life would be as lonely and desolate as when I became an Army nurse. Signed, Belle Coddington, Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Belle Coddington and Eli Helmick Coddington are related. If you go back in my family tree, Coddingtons came here in the mid-17th century. A century later, in the mid-18th century, a branch, the ones that moved from New England to New Jersey, well, one branch moved to Maryland, and from that branch came Eli Helmick Coddington, who settled in Iowa, was wounded in battle, suffered the amputation of an arm, married Belle, and tragically died too early. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.